Let's start this hour with a look at the Occupy Wall Street movement. Protesters around the country are standing their ground despite attempts by many others to dismantle the movement. In Richmond, Virginia, for example, members of the Tea Party there have apparently given the mayor a bill for $8,000, the amount they say the Occupy protesters should pay for staying in the park. They say they're not going to leave. And in Oakland, California, protesters have reclaimed their square. They were staying in after the Oakland mayor decided to scale back police presence after some pretty violent pictures have upset masses of people around the country, even around the world. These pictures, of course, of police in riot gear using tear gas and non-lethal projectiles to try to clear protesters out of the way. One of those protesters, you see him here, Iraq veteran Scott Olson. He was critically injured. You can see him being carried off with a fractured skull and brain swelling from a blunt force trauma. Possibly that happened from an exploding tear gas canister. Much of the movement, of course, just outside Wall Street itself. And I want to go now to New York and talk to RT producer Lucy Kafanov. Lucy, talk to me about what you're seeing. I know you spent a lot of this month in Zuccotti Park. You came back here to Washington for a few days, and now you are back in New York. What is the latest that you can tell us about?
Well, one of the things that I was really struck by, Christine, was sort of the way that the physical encampment has really changed. I mean, it looks a lot bigger and more impressive than before. And of course, the rain and the bad weather today is a bad indicator of numbers. But as opposed to last time, we now have all of these giant tents that have popped up across Zuccotti Park, Liberty Plaza, as they like to call it. And that raises some interesting issues. For one, when things were more open in the past, for example, a lot of times it was easier for the protesters, for the organizers to sort of keep track on things, make sure that sort of illegal activities weren't going on, that people were behaving themselves, and keep out sort of the so-called riffraff. So a lot of the protesters, in fact, that I've spoken to have expressed the concern that these tents are now going to be a dividing factor in numerous ways. It's an opportunity for Bloomberg, theoretically, to come and crack down even harder. A lot of people are really suspicious as to why there hasn't been sort of a more aggressive response by the police on these tents, because it was one of the sort of illegal things that they're not supposed to do in this area. And the other thing is, again, they really feel like it's sort of divided the camp. There's a lot more different elements there. You know, they have privacy in the tents. No one really knows exactly what's going on. And so it just looks a little bit more imposing and a little bit less open and friendly and democratic than it did before in the past.
I'm wondering, Lucy,
a lot of, go ahead.
I haven't been down to Zuccotti Park. I've only been here in D.C. to McPherson Square to Occupy D.C. I didn't realize there weren't any tents before, or were there a few? And you say there's a lot more now. How many more?
Tons. I mean, at least 100 that I've counted.
Wow.
And that was actually one of the funny issues, because when we had the anticipated major crackdown by the Bloomberg administration just a few weeks ago, when there was thousands of protesters in the park, that was one of the things that police would go into the park to physically sort of break down and remove and arrest protesters for. So a lot of people are very suspicious as to why the New York City Police Department isn't really acting on this. They're sort of anticipating for perhaps the proverbial other shoe to drop.
Well, perhaps one of those reasons, Lucy, is, of course, what we saw in Oakland, those pictures out of Oakland and how much they've really upset people, kind of a violent reaction there by police who used these non-lethal projectiles, who used tear gas. And as we saw, an Iraq War veteran severely injured. I want to know, I know you're in New York, but from what I understand, a lot of the protesters in New York have really gained strength from what they saw in Oakland. What have you seen?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I completely agree with that. In fact, I've spoken to at least 3 different protesters who now came out today, or last night, to be more accurate, specifically because of this reaction. You know, they were shocked to see this kind of level of crackdown in their own country for essentially nonviolent actions. And while it has rallied a few more people to the cause, so to speak, it has been sort of interesting to see how it's changed the nature of the protests here. Some of the organizers that have been here in New York from day one said that this sort of, they do a lot of this non-violent training where, you know, they ask people to stay calm and sort of get their message across without actually getting aggressive with the police. And a lot of that, they said, went out the window last night, where several hundred, if not 1,000 protesters marched across New York, getting a little bit more aggressive with police, shaking barricades, in some cases pulling netting, the infamous orange netting, out of the police hands. And what many protesters said to me is that they were really surprised by the sort of mild, unusually mild response by the police force here, because remember, this is the same police force that peppered sprayed women, drove a scooter over a police NYPD scooter over an attorney's leg, and beat several protesters down. So again, they're very they don't know what exactly to make of this. You know, is the police force calming down because the mayor and the city has realized that this has gotten too big to sort of continue the bad kind of PR with the crackdowns? Or is this a sign of something to come? And a lot of the mood here in the park is quite wary. They really think that, that something immense is going to happen in the next few days, where there will be some sort of crackdown, a massive crackdown, to essentially stop the occupation. They don't know why there's this sudden lull in the storm, so to speak.
Interesting. So perhaps behind closed doors, police are planning something, and in the interim, they're going to just lay low. Interesting theory. I hadn't thought about that. I'm wondering, as a result of this, or as a result of anything, what we can expect to come, in the coming days and weeks. I know that in Oakland, they've called for a general strike and a mass day of action. That's set for November 2nd. I do know also on the weekends, we often see a lot larger numbers come out. Anything that you've heard in terms of events planned or training or anything there in Zuccotti Park?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Oakland General Strike. That's actually one of the proposals that folks here are considering doing, which would be sort of unprecedented if they were able to pull it off. A general strike means, taxi drivers stop working, students cut school, workers, employees take off from work. Whether or not they'll be effective in that remains to be seen. But a recent New York Times poll, in fact, one that came out today, says that 87% of New York residents now support the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is a huge jump from last week, where it was about 67%. We know there isn't a mass sort of action planned along the likes of what we saw with the Brooklyn Bridge rally or Times Square, but they're doing a lot of sort of defensive training because, again, as I mentioned, the general mood here is that something is going to happen. They don't quite know what this lull is, but they're quite concerned about it. In fact, on Sunday, one of the organizers I spoke to said that they're going to be sort of doing a fake run in terms of what to do if the police actually crack down and try to clear the park. So they'll be going through different practice actions, how to defend, so to speak, the territory. They're putting together in place this text messaging alert system because Twitter is so notoriously unreliable in terms of when things are actually getting out of hand. And that's actually one of the text message alert system is one of the things that was able to get so many people turned out in Oakland when that devastating action took place. So I guess Wednesday, the November 2nd general strike would be a day to watch for. But a lot of focus also later in November, November 17th and 28th. Mass rallies are planned then, not just here in New York, but across the country and the world. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Should be interesting also to keep our eye on this as the weather continues to turn. I know it was rainy here today, rainy there. Some of the protesters here have been talking a lot about how to stay through the winter. They're planning on staying through the snow, through the sleet, and we will, of course, keep our eyes. And Lucy, we'll keep you there, too. RT producer Lucy Kafanov in New York City. And to get the up-to-the-date latest news from the Occupy Wall Street front lines in New York, you can log on to Lucy's Twitter page. She is at Lucy Kafanov.